the conviction of things not seen. Alleluia. Alleluia. The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 14th chapter. Glory to you, Lord. Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat, by this time, was many furlongs distant from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately he spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, have no fear." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, bid me come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "O man of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Grace, peace, and much joy to you, people of God. Our gospel today begins with Jesus praying alone on the mountain and ends with the disciples worshiping him in the boat. You remember last week's gospel told us that Jesus was trying to get away by himself to pray, going away to a lonely place after he heard the news of the death of John the Baptist. But the crowds would have none of it. They came to the place, he healed their sick, he fed the whole throng miraculously, and now, after the meal, late in the day, he dismisses the crowds, sends his disciples across the lake in the boat, and finally gets his opportunity to go up on the mountain by himself to pray. This is important because the very center of Jesus' being is prayer. His unbroken communion with the one he calls Father. Finally, he gets a chance to pray. But the disciples out on the boat, as Jesus is on the mountain in prayer, are having a rough time of it. From late afternoon until the fourth watch of the night, which for those of you who aren't aware of the Roman changes of the guard during the night, is between 3 and 6 in the morning. So for the better part of 12 hours, the disciples are trying to make their way against a headwind with choppy seas and not having a very good journey of it. And so in the midst of that wind and storm, there in the darkness before the dawn, when they see a figure coming toward them across the water, no wonder they're terrified and think it's a ghost. But Jesus speaks to them immediately. Take heart, it is I, have no fear. Take heart, have no fear. We understand that part. The "it is I" is actually a little more complicated, though, because in Greek that's ego eimi. Take heart, I am. Have no fear. That's the name of God revealed to Moses at the burning bush. I am. I am what? I am. I am being itself. Jesus is revealing himself, his divinity, to the disciples walking across the sea as big a miracle as the feeding of the multitude in last week's gospel, so that the disciples might trust him as he reveals himself. The response to the revelation of Jesus' divinity is faith in him. And so, here's Peter, first among the 12, stepping out in faith, right? We love this story about Peter stepping out and walking on the water. But is this really the Peter of great faith? Or is this the impetuous Peter who sometimes doesn't seem to be really entirely sure what's going on? Yes, he steps out in faith, but then his doubt and fear, the doubt is manifested in the if. Lord, if it is you. Sounds kind of like an earlier series of questions. If you are the Son of God. Lord, if it is you. And then, of course, when he sees the wind, he begins to sink. His doubt and his fear would sink him to the bottom, were it not for the fact that he calls out to Jesus, Lord, save me. And the Lord saves him. For as St. Paul tells us in the epistle, quoting the prophet Joel, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. But it is not that Peter steps out in faith. It's when they get into the boat that the wind ceases. It's not about being a spiritual avatar. It's about being a member of the church. The boat, the navis, is a symbol for the church. The main part of the church is called the nave. This is the boat in which we are saved. This is the boat in which we call upon the name of the Lord and are saved. More specifically, we confess with our lips that Jesus is Lord and believe in our hearts the greatest miracle of all, that God raised him from the dead. We don't have to go up to heaven to bring Christ down to us. He comes to us in the midst of the storms of our life. The wind and the storms are the trials and tribulations of our lives. And Jesus comes revealing himself to us, asking us to trust him, to believe in him, even in the midst of those storms, in the darkness just before the dawn. But of course, how can we call upon him if we have not heard of him? And how can we hear of him unless there is someone to proclaim him? And how can anyone proclaim him unless someone is sent? It is the word of proclamation that brings our lips to the confession of faith and our hearts to the belief in Jesus, who has been raised up from the abyss by the Father in the power of the Spirit, so that we might trust him. Yes, it's so we can call upon him, so we can hear of him, so we can believe in him, so we can hear the proclamation. Well, that's what preaching is. It's a very high view of preaching that St. Paul gives us in the 10th chapter of Romans. But of course, that is not all in the riches that the lectionary lays out before us. This morning we learned that God actually speaks to us in other ways besides in preaching. Astonishing, I know. But if we look at Elijah in the first reading, he's on the run from Jezebel. He has concluded the famous contest with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Baal was Jezebel's favorite god, and his prophets did not do well in that contest, but she swore that she would have her revenge on Elijah, and Elijah ran away. No wonder the voice of God says to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Lack of trust there as well. But Elijah is promised a theophany. The appearance of Jesus walking on the water, showing his divinity, that's a theophany, a manifestation of God in the world. And just so, the theophany that's promised to Elijah has to make him think of the theophany that Moses received. The voice of God says to Elijah, "The Lord is about to pass by." And that's what happened for Moses. God hid him in a cleft of a rock, and he passed by so that Moses could see the glory of God after he had passed. And so Elijah is ready for one of these great theophanies like Moses had on top of Mount Sinai. So there's the wind, and the earthquake, and the fire. But God isn't in any of those. It's after the storm has passed, in Elijah's case, that he hears what our translation calls the sound of sheer silence. An older translation says it's a still, small voice. It's the whispering God, saying again, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah talks about how difficult his life and ministry have been, the winds and storms that he's had to deal with. But God reassures him. Yes, the enemies of God are many, but I will leave 7,000 in Israel. There will be 7,000, a remnant, who have not bowed down to Baal or kissed him. There will still be those who trust him. And so whether God comes to us as Jesus did to the disciples in the midst of the storms and headwinds of life, reassuring us of his presence and asking for our trust, or whether he comes to us after the storm is over in the sheer silence, the still small voice of conscience, helping us to interpret what it is that we are experiencing in our lives, and then move on in trust. These are ways that God is actively manifest in our lives, in the world, in history, in time. God is not just some far-off creator. If only we could bring him down to us. And Jesus did not just die on the cross and go down into the earth to death. He has been raised. It is our faith in his rising that is saving faith. That goes hand in hand with our confession that he is the Lord of our lives. And that comes to us whether by miraculous appearance in the midst of a storm, whether in the voice of conscience, in the silence of our hearts, or even in the proclamation in the boat of the church. It is all so that we might come to trust. This word is not far from us. It is on our lips. It is in our hearts for us to trust and obey. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.